Good evening, folks. This is Miguel Iturrate, and this is the MMA Museum podcast. And we're taking a walk here, one of our history podcasts with pioneer, a true pioneer, and to be honest with you, a friend of mine. So I expect to have a lot of fun this podcast. We are joined by, veteran of all kinds of organizations, Dave Strasser. Dave, how you been?
Great, man. Absolutely great.
Dave's a funny guy. I think he's doing some school teaching right now, and he's become a school teacher, and he's teaching math. And hopefully we'll come back and revisit that at the end of the podcast. But right now, for starters, I just kind of want to get into this. So, Dave, talk a little bit about your youth and growing up. Just, I think you wrestled. Were you a wrestler? At what point did you wrestle, and how did you become caught up in the mixed martial arts?
Well, I guess my youth was a basic one where I did most sports like basketball during basketball season, baseball during the summer, and we just played football out in the yard with people and stuff like that. So, but the structured sports was just baseball and basketball. And my mom didn't want me to play football until high school, so I went out my freshman year in high school football, and I was like, we only had like 14 kids on the team, and I was really little. I was like 100 pounds, maybe 105 pounds, and I was like the only one not to play. And it was like my dad was a football star and stuff like that, so it kind of hurt me. Like, I want to be like my dad. I want to be the high school star and stuff, but it did not start that way. And it was frustrating and stuff like that, but it was one of those things that I stuck with it, and I think that made me just the year on the bench and just being down. I said, well, I gotta build myself up. So a lot of my friends were going for basketball. I said, no, it's not going to help me in football for going for basketball. So I chose wrestling. I said, I'm going to go for wrestling. Never wrestled ever. And people are like, well, why are you going to go for wrestling? These kids have wrestled, some of them, middle school, grade school. I said, well, it's going to get me better. I don't care if I ever wrestle, but it's going to get me better for football. And that was my goal. So I went out for wrestling. And actually one of the guys on the team at the time he was on the football team, and he wrestled in grade school. He would almost be like, to be considered a bully now. And he said, man, I'm going to beat you in wrestling. I'm like, all right. I don't know what I'm doing. So he challenged me one day, and I'm like, fine, I'll wrestle him. And so I wrestled him and beat him, and then everyone's like, good, that kid's got a mouth and stuff like that. But we actually became real good friends and stuff like that. But then it was one of those situations so I started wrestling, and they said, why don't you do a wrestling tournament? I said, no, I don't want to wrestle. I just want to train to get better for football. But they said, well, there's this tournament coming up, and it was like West Dallas Central. It was one of the biggest tournaments there. And so they put me in there, and it was at 110 pounds. And back then, I didn't know how to cut weight or anything. And I was like 112 the day before. You wrestle, you weigh in the morning. And I'm like, that's 2 pounds. And they're like, yeah, just lose it. So I lost the weight the day before, not knowing how to cut weight. I just didn't eat nothing. And I made weight that night. And then I didn't eat or drink anything until it was like at 6 o'clock I made weight. And like the next morning we had to weigh in at 8. I didn't eat or drink anything. And I think I weighed in like at 107 pounds or something ridiculous. And it was for 110 pounds, I think. It was for freshman tournament. So I went there and stuff. And so I was the 8th seed because I'd never wrestled before. And these other kids had, they had records for that year. Like, it was my first wrestling event. And so the first kid, he took me down, but I kind of escaped, turned around, took him down and pinned him. So I pinned the number 1 seed kid. And then they said, okay, next one's going to be coming up or something. And I was just hanging out with my buddy. We're eating a hot dog or something like that because I didn't know what to do. And all of a sudden they announced me. I said, oh, I got to go wrestling. He goes, oh, I'll coach you. So my buddy coached me wrestling. And it was one of those situations that, he was like, put in the half. And the guy would turn away. He goes, put in the other half. I was jumping half. And he was just putting both halves. So I did that, and I got a penalty point. But then I really, because they're like, hey, you can't do that. I'm like, I don't know. First wrestling. So that was like the only point I gave up. I beat him like 8-1 or something like that. And I went to the finals and beat the kid like 9-0. So it was my first wrestling match. And, I really kind of got into wrestling.
And so now I knew you had a wrestling background, obviously. So you started late as a freshman, but obviously
Yeah.
I'm going to do pretty good because of what we went. But how did you meet Yasunori Matsumoto? Because that's where some of the MMA stuff begins in your world.
Yeah, well, to go back, that wrestling, one of the kids on the wrestling team, Dale Porter, his dad was Dale Porter, which is a real famous boxing guy. He goes, "Hey, you should try boxing." So I picked up boxing while in high school and wrestling. So that was kind of my start of MMA. Boxing and wrestling is probably the two basics. So that's where I started. He was like a legendary trainer, and he took me to tournaments and stuff like that, and I just go box and stuff like that wherever he told me. What happened then, I went to college and I'd come back in the summer and do boxing or I'd wrestle. I mean, I played football in college up in Oshkosh. I did rugby. I went with the wrestling team a couple times just to practice and stuff like that. But in the summer, then I'd do boxing. When I graduated college, I moved to Chicago and I got a job as a live-in foster parent. So I had to live in a boys' group home as the foster parent. I was 22 years old, and these kids were from 16 to 18. And so when they said, "Okay, you're off now, you don't have to be back till like 10 o'clock at night." So I was off like a lot. I found a gym, Chicago Fitness Center, right by Wrigley Field. I was living in Wrigleyville, and that's where Matsumoto was training. And they were training in the Shidokan style, which is a bare knuckle style. And so I picked it up because, I needed something to do. So I did that, the bare knuckle karate and stuff like that. And then that was that time where they started like kind of adding throws and like 15 seconds on the ground type thing. So
Okay.
they call it the triathlon of MMA. So it's bare knuckle, and then we did kickboxing, and then we did some ground, like really light ground.
Okay. Now,
And he
let me,
was
let me just place a little perspective on this. This is circa 1995, 96 era that you're in Chicago and you come across Matsumoto. Matsumoto will be famous for fighting Pat Miletich in Pat Miletich's debut. And the story behind that fight is that Miletich at some point broke his arm and Matsumoto kept fighting with a broken arm. So
yeah.
we'll get to that, but I'm going to let Dave take us there.
Yeah. So what happened was, while I was training at the Chicago Fitness Center, they said that there was a bare knuckle world tournament they're going to do out in Japan, the World Championships of the Shidokan, and they needed a 155 pounder. And like I said, in high school, I wrestled at 167, but I never cut weight. So I said, well, 55, I could do that. So I got in shape, got my weight down to 55, and did the bare knuckle. I did the bare knuckle there. Matsumoto was our heavyweight representative from the U.S., and I think it was like 42 different countries went there. And I had real good success. It was my first tournament, and I had real good success that they wanted me to stay 6 months. So Matsumoto told me to stay 6 months. As soon as I got off the plane, I've never been on a plane, never been on a country. So I'm like, all right, I'll stay 6 months. I said, what do I do? He goes, don't ask questions. I said, I mean, what do I eat? Don't ask questions. Whatever they do, make you do, just do it. You know what I mean? So I'm like, all right. So as I was there, because they made this big program and stuff like that about the world tournament and stuff. They said, we can't just send you with 1 year of training. We have to kind of beef it up. So they put that I was a Golden Gloves champ. I was a Thai boxing champ. I was all these titles I had. And I had fought Golden Gloves. I took second in the Chicago Golden Gloves in like the Masters division. But it was like I never did kickboxing and never did Muay Thai, just practiced it. But they had to put that in a resume just to make it sound like I was a legitimate competitor. So as I was there, they just wake me up in the middle of the night, take me to fights, have me fight, run hills, do whatever. So I did whatever. Well, that was the time I think the UFC was coming out, or just before I left, it started coming out, or something like that. That's where Tom Lutuli started promoting the shows in Chicago. I think it was called Chicago Combat or something like that. And that's where Matsumoto entered, and that's where he fought Pat Miletich. I think Rick Gravison fought on the card, a couple of other guys. And Matsumoto fought Pat Miletich, and Pat got his back. I mean, he was mostly wrestling, got his back, and came out like armbarred him, but he would not tap. Matsumoto was one of those guys that would not tap, not quit. I believe he broke his arm. They kept fighting. He was probably a 20-minute, 30-minute fight, whatever it was. Because back then we didn't have time limits. And that's when I came back, and he fought and stuff like that. He couldn't even move his arm. I remember that. I'm like, why don't you just tap? Because like, no, I have honor and stuff like that. Well, I'm like, all right. I mean, end of the day, it's kind of a sport. You know what I mean? Yes, there's an honor thing. But that's where he was doing that. And I did a couple more kickboxing matches and stuff like that. And I kept saying, I want to learn more ground, more jujitsu and stuff like that. And Matsumoto would say, no, no, we don't do that. We do, bare knuckle. Shidokan is what we do. Shidokan karate. We don't add things to it. And that's why I said, well, I think it'd be better if we did. And that was the time that, after being in Chicago a while, I decided I wanted to actually move to California because that was the only place I was doing jujitsu, and I knew Rickson Gracie was out there and stuff. And as I was in Japan, they had that Japanese wrestler challenge him in California. I forgot his name, but it's on the internet. He challenged him at the gym, and he got beat up. And then I think even when I was in Japan, Rickson fought that one tournament.
The Yoji.
Yes. He fought in that tournament. I think that guy from Holland fought in that tournament. The bobsledder from the U.S. did, and Rickson Gracie won the tournament. And so I was there.
That's Valley Tudo, Japan, 94.
I was there from 94 to 95, I believe.
Did you see it? Did you see that tournament live? Or did you just watch
No, I didn't see that, but I was there where Duke Rufus fought Kitsongret. Chunkpet Kinsongret or whatever, that Thai boxer. I was there for that. No, not for that one. Not for that. That was Rick Rufus. No, I was there when Duke Rufus fought Andy Hoog from Sweden, I think.
Okay, yeah.
So I was there for that one because I went there and I fought on some of those undercards and things like that. So I was there for that fight.
Cool.
But it was one of those situations that I was kind of like just in the background and seeing like kind of the birth of MMA on that end and how when I was coming back, it started like growing locally with like, the Chicago Challenge or whatever they called it. Or so then when I came back, I want to do more ground. And this was like in January, February of 90. No, I forgot when that was, right around there, maybe. I decided I wanted to move to California to learn jujitsu. So I packed up everything in my car, everything I had, and I was going to drive out to California. Well, as I was driving out there, I hit like it was a big snowstorm. And, I was going to drive out to my sister. She was living in Coralville, Iowa, right by Iowa City. And my other sister was actually living in California. And she said, why don't you just stay there? If you come out here, you're going to have to work a lot and stuff. Can't you find another gym out there? I said, well, I'm in Iowa right now. I know Pat Miletich was there. I'll look into that. But I said, so I went and I found Pat Miletich and I wanted to train with him. And I think they thought I was like, oh, he's with Matsumoto because I think they set up Pat versus Matsumoto like a super fight in Iowa. So I said, no, I just want to train. I mean, my goal is to go out to California, but I was going to train there while I was there. So I started training with them. And then I said, well, my sister in California, I said, look, I want to come out there and want to train at Rickson Gracie's gym, right? So like I flew in, it was like a July 4th weekend, and I got like a layover in Vegas was like delayed or something. I finally got into California. It was like 8 a.m. And she goes, well, I called them at Rickson Gracie's and I said that you wanted to train jujitsu. And they said, well, if he wants to take classes, he's got to go to Torrance. And the way my sister worded it, she goes, no, he doesn't want to train. He just wants to fight you. And I'm like, how can you say that? She's like, no, they'll understand. No, I said, no, they're going to think I want to fight you. No, Dave, they won't. And I'm like, whatever. So I actually went there. And I said, hey, my sister called and goes, oh, you're the guy that wants to fight us. I said, no. It was like a July 4th, like that weekend or something. And there was like nobody there. And the guy goes, well, go get your gi on. And I said, well, we don't practice with gis. And he's like, how do you do jujitsu without gis? I'm like, I don't know. We just grapple. He goes, well, here, at least you have to wear pants. And my first thought, it was like because of cleanliness or something. I didn't know. But I realized how much more you can pass the guard with gi pants on without the guard. And like it's a whole different game. So I actually, they brought out one of their instructors or something to roll with me. And he had a hard time beating me. And I didn't, like I said, I only been training jujitsu a little bit, but I had a good base from wrestling and things like that. So I was able to at least, and I never rolled to beat anybody. I rolled to learn. So I was actually doing that. And it took about 20 minutes before the guy first tapped me. And the guy came out, he goes, "Oh my gosh, you're really good at this. You're Oompa and your escape." And I'm like, "Yeah, I don't even know what I'm doing half the time." And he goes, "Well, how do you do out in Iowa?" I said, "Oh, those guys beat me all the time." I didn't want to kind of sound humble. Well, the guy got pissed. He's like, "All right, let's go again." I'm like, "All right." And he threw me in a headlock. And I'm like, "All right, maybe he knows something I don't know." But I actually escaped and kind of did well, like I said. And I wasn't trying to beat anybody or anything. And the next thing you know, it was like the whole gym started getting people lined up and were kind of watching us. I don't know where they came from. And different people just start rolling with me. And, I mean, it's like fresh meat and stuff like that. So I rolled probably about 2 or 3 hours that day, just like nonstop. I mean, it was such a good learning experience. I learned a lot because, where we trained in Iowa was almost off videos and trying new things and stuff like that. But they were like way ahead of the game out there. So that's when I really got, and I came back. I said, "You guys, we got to train different in jujitsu. They're doing different things. They're not so basic and things like that." So that's how I kind of got with Pat and the whole birth of the MMA started.
So now the Matsumoto fight with Pat, obviously when they rematched, you fought. It looks like was your first or second fight with Travis Fulton?
That was my second fight. The first fight, it was GG or CC Sierra, GC Sierra.
Okay.
That was a fight. That was the Matsumoto fight that I fought, and that was the one I'd only been training at Pat's a month or two or whatever it was, maybe 3 months, and that's when they fought, and that was the first time I seen Matsumoto in a while, and Matsumoto, he was courteous to me and stuff like that, didn't say anything bad, and I've seen some of the old students and stuff like that, so. But I think Pat beat him with a TKO or something like that after 20 minutes or whatever it was. But again, Matsumoto was Matsumoto, just kind of like always there, not explosive, but just never quitting or anything like that. So it was a good fight, but Pat.
But you fought. What I'm getting to the point though is like for the early going here, as we go through here, you fought. I mentioned Travis Fulton there on that second show. Then you went on to the extreme. You fought on Monty Cox's very first Extreme Challenge.
Yeah.
Rolando Higueros. What do you remember about the first Extreme?
That was out in I think it was in Iowa City. Was it Ames, Iowa, or?
Okay, let me check.
I remember because that was.
Yeah, go ahead.
That was what they called, I think, Pat Militich's versus the Midwest All Stars, I believe, or something like that. It was in it's a pretty big barn place, but I think they have like the state championships for wrestling or something like that. That was one of Bob Schirmer's guys. And he was a tough guy. He was shorter than me and stuff like that, but it was one of those situations that, we're learning MMA and stuff like this, and he would just like wing punches. So it wasn't boxing. People like, "Oh, just jab, jab." I'm like, "You guys don't understand. It's not like you can outpoint people. You got to be careful. You can like land little jabs, but the big punches are what's going to hurt." So that was one of the things. It was a tough fight. He's a real good fighter, but I was able to take him down, and I landed an elbow to split him open. And after a couple minutes, or it was a pretty long fight, but after landing that elbow, I split his eye open, and then I think they stopped it because of the cut.
Yeah, you got about 8 minutes in there, and then from there, So what? Describe the show though. The first Extreme Challenge. I mean, did you have weigh-ins? Did you have doctors, medicals? Did you have gloves?
No, you know what? I don't remember. I remember everybody could bring their own gloves and stuff like that for the first couple. And Travis Fulton, I think copied Tank Abbott. I'm not Travis Fulton. Jeremy Horn. And what they get is those black gloves from Century. I forgot what they called them. They were small gloves, and they would take a stitch remover and remove like there's a little band here and a couple other paddings, and like cut open the middle to give you like grip on that, so to protect your hands. Most of us never even like we had like little white padding, maybe. I think maybe Monty gave us some white padding gloves maybe on our first couple. But yeah, nobody, wrapped their hands, I remember. There was actually the first time I remember somebody wrapping their hands was a guy by the name of Paul Wells. And the reason he did that is I think he broke his thumb in training and he had like a pin sticking out of his thumb. So he wrapped it up. So, and because I'm like, why are you fighting? He goes, this may never happen again. I want to be part of the first show or something like that, or first couple. So he was a tough guy. Like I said, there was characters in there, and he was one of those tough guys that are, probably didn't know what they were doing too much, but
yeah, but they had the balls to get in there. Yeah, no, there were a lot of those guys. So the next time you come out, you go to now by Extreme Challenge 5, Monty's developing a little bit. You're still in 1997, so we're in old time. But now this is you have a 4-man tournament here, and if anybody remembers the 1997 period in the Midwest, you fought 2 real tough guys. One was Jesse Jones, who was a Jeremy Horn student, and another guy is the mysterious Kaz Daniels. Daniels, I understand now, Daniels isn't even his real name. The guy had toured the country as a male stripper, kind of with a character and a name and stuff, and also did fighting. But he's out there now. He's got Kaz Daniels ain't his real name, but he was tough as hell.
Oh yeah, no, that was a tough fight. Both of those were real tough fights. That was in was it Cedar Rapids, I believe, where we fought. But yeah, that was a tough fight. I remember that. I remember specifically fighting Jesse Jones because he had just beaten somebody like in 15 seconds or something. He was one of those guys that just came out fast. And I remember being on the ground and his guard, just kind of the grinding him down and stuff like that, trying to pass the guard and stuff like that. I remember people like yelling, just get up and fight, get up and fight. And then I remember Pat Miletich was a ref. He's like, this is fighting. He's like, no, they're not. They're just laying on each other. And like, no, they're, and he was like arguing with the members of the crowd. So a lot of those early fights, I remember crowd people kind of booing and stuff like that, and not really understanding what was going on. So they were learning just as much as the fighters were learning. But yeah, that was a tough tournament. Yeah,
for sure. What was your impression of the organization? Was it getting better? Was it getting more organized? Because Monty's a guy that was always doing little things, but still, that's those were chaotic days.
No, Monty had like experience because I believe he promoted, I think, Hector Camacho or something in a boxing match in Iowa, so he knew how to have a bigger one and things like that. So and I think he followed Tom Latuli's lead because he went out there and he realized, hey, this is like the next part of it because Chicago's having some big fights and he knew he could sell I think the Quad City Coliseum or whatever they called it with the Quad City Thunder played and stuff like that. That was so he kind of knew how to run that, and he's done that before. I think he also did like a pro wrestling promotion, so he's done promotions before. So it's just he knew how to run a promotion. Just the sport became different.
All right, so now let me ask you: how did you settle in Milwaukee? Because it's and tell the story about how you left Miletich, because I always found that to be funny.
Well, what happened was before I went out there, I'd been working in a nursing home, and that's where I met my now ex-fiance. In a nursing home, she was a nurse, and I was just, I don't know, it was in a social work department or something like that. And we met, and that's where we decided to get married and stuff like that. After I said, well, I'm gonna move out to California first or something. And then I got stuck in Iowa, and she, I think, went down to Florida for a little bit, but then came back and was in Westmont, Illinois. And that's where we decided to get married. And I really wanted her to move to Iowa so I could continue training stuff. But she wanted me to move to Illinois because she really liked Illinois and she had some of her classmates there. So we decided to move to Kenosha, Wisconsin, so neither of us would be happy. So that's how we decided to move to Wisconsin.
That's a good decision. That's a good decision. Now, in Wisconsin, the one of the themes we already touched on is that in the early going, you had some tough experience, obviously. exposed to Miletich and stuff, big stuff, Matsumoto taking you to Japan and stuff. Then your fights with Daniels and Jones is tough stuff. Now, how did the rivalry with Adrian Serrano go? Where's Serrano? Because Adrian is from Milwaukee, and he was a guy who was definitely already a veteran. You were the young guy coming up. So talk about Serrano and how that became a rivalry for you.
Well, the first time we fought was out in Iowa. I think it was Des Moines, Iowa. We fought in like a bar, Big Frog Bar or something like that. So that was the first time we fought, and it was a draw. I mean, he won that fight. It wasn't a real draw. I mean, but back then there was like, I don't know, 15-minute time limits, and after that, if nobody won, it was called a draw. But I mean, he won that one. I didn't know exactly how to train yet, and we're new at the whole conditioning and how to do this, and quote unquote the point system or whatever. So it was a growing span. Monty wanted to do a fight here, and I'd moved to Kenosha. And that's when he promoted the fight here at the Broad Stop, and that's where I had my second fight with him. The second fight was really close. It was one of those that I believe I won that fight, but it was close that I could see either of us being called for the winner and stuff like that. Again, it's kind of like subjective on who won and stuff like that. And there was a decision either way. So that's how that got started. And then, when I started promoting it, I knew that he was a big draw. So I promoted some shows with him as one of the headliners, just to kind of like build on the shows that I would be doing.
All right, so there wasn't any real bad blood. It was just the kind of thing that you don't really like to lose. So you kind of, didn't like him for a little bit, but then later on you work with him and stuff like that. That's cool. That's all right.
I mean, I don't dislike anybody, but I do know that conflict sells tickets. And if I can create some kind of conflict and people are like, oh, there's some conflict, I'll do it. I mean, I know how the game is played and stuff like that, and what people like kind of a storyline behind the story. So yeah, there was no bad blood or nothing like that.
So now, as we go forward here, it looks like you finally got out to California for some fights in a neutral ground show.
Yep.
So now one of the guys on there is another guy like yourself that, put 2 decades into their careers, a guy named Toby Amato. What do you remember about that fight, Neutral Grounds 12?
First of all, the first thing I remember.
Rather.
What is it?
It's Neutral Grounds 13, rather.
Okay. The one thing I remember about the fight more than anything was that I think we started at like 5 or 6 in the afternoon, and we didn't end till like midnight. And I fought twice, and I fought some guy. One of those guys like probably watching the UFC and stuff like that. They called it Thug Jiu-Jitsu or something like that. I think their team name was, or something like that. And so I beat him, and then I think I fought maybe like 3, 4, or 5 hours. It was a long time. I wish I had a timestamp, but I remember almost like taking a nap and being tired. And then when I was up, I remember that it probably being about 32 degrees. Like, it was so cold when I was supposed to fight. So I was getting in the ring. And we had to leave wherever we had to warm up was like a pavilion. And it was probably about a half a mile walk. And actually, when Jeremy goes, hey, they have a car that can drive you or something. I said, no, I got to get warmed up. Let's just walk. So we walked there, and I think Jens Pulver was the guy that asked me for a ride. He goes, hey, you need a ride? I said, no, I'm okay. So I was like, the first time I met Jens Pulver, you meet people down the road. It's just little happenstance. You meet little person here. And I think that was the one that I met, I think Mask. Mask came to that one, or Rome, Georgia, when I fought down there. So it was like little times like that you start meeting people. But I remember about that fight was getting in the ring, right? They announced me. And then there was a fight before me, and I think it was with one of the Gracies. I don't know if it was Henzo Gracie's student or something. They started yelling at me for being in the ring because they first wanted to announce their fighter as a winner of the tournament because they didn't have a match. I'm like, look, I'm just trying to stay here. So I was like standing underneath one of those lights to try to get warm because it was so cold, and I didn't even have like a sweatshirt on because I was like all warmed up. So I just remember it being so cold. And then that was probably the fight that I had one of the best arm bars I had in from the bottom. I had one of those beautiful arm bars. I spun and then he like face planted and I hipped out. So it was one of the best arm bars I had.
That's cool. He's a tough guy. Obviously, later on down the line, you've seen the submission he pulled off on Masvidal,
Yeah.
right?
No, he was very, I mean, that's the thing. They were usually back then, if people were fighting, they were good. Here, I mean, we still have real high level guys, but when there's so many guys fighting now, you kind of run into guys that aren't that good. So, but no, he was really good. I mean, and Kaz Daniels was probably my other armbar, but that was from his back that I hit a really nice armbar.
Yeah. Now, how was this trip to California? Like, how'd you get the fight? How did that get arranged? I see Serrano was out there. Pulver may have been with Jeremy Horn at that point. Horn was the main event. Are you fitting in with these Midwest guys, or like?
Yeah, I went out there because I was living in Kenosha here, and I went out there. I think I had to drive out to Iowa to fly out of because that's where they bought my ticket or something like that. I just remember that I had to fly out there to do that. But no, I actually roomed with Jeremy Horn. I cornered him. And what I remember that he fought John Marsh,
Yeah.
and John Marsh was on top the whole time. They were right by our face, and he was like, I mean, we didn't know like if you think about it, you're gonna like if the top guy's on top, he's gonna win. So it looked like he was beating Jeremy Horn. So he was right by the cage, and I just remember like making fun of him. Like John's not even punching. He's afraid of punching Jeremy. And so John would get up and start punching. Well, that would give Jeremy room to do his moves and stuff like that. So it was one of those situations that, cornermen don't usually win fights, but I think me yelling that kind of stuff, I remember John like reacting to what I was saying. But I was a cornerman with Monty for that. And then after that, he won a belt. And so we were rooming together. I remember I got up in the morning because I can't sleep all the time. So I got up in the morning and I got buck naked and I took his belt that he won that night and I put it on and I stood over Jeremy Horn. I'm like, hey, Jeremy, see anything you like? So
Yeah.
that was
That
that'll wake him up.
Yeah, you're a weirdo, dude.
No doubt about that. I'm not going to deny that.
But that takes me back to let's tell the story about how you got thrown out of Militich's too, because it's actually very funny.
I never got thrown out of Militich. I left when I got married, but I went out there and stuff like that. I don't think that's a story.
There was an incident.
Which one?
Wasn't Pat at some point showing the gym to like a family and you were doing
yeah. That didn't get me kicked out. It was Nick Tarpin because it was in Nick Tarpin's gym, and I was wrestling Nate Schroeder. And when I mean, it's one of those situations that Nate could be really serious, but then he could like kind of goof around. We started wrestling, and all we started doing was like pulling each other's shorts down. So we would wrestle and pull each other's shorts down as we were wrestling, and then that was when Tommy Boy was out, so we'd call each other thinners. You know what I mean? So we were wrestling that, and then all of a sudden Nick Tarpin comes like, "Oh, this is our grappling," and it's like two guys with their shorts pulled down, just rolling on the ground, and he didn't say anything. He's a couple like it was like a family of four that just walked by us and they shook our heads, and it was boys being boys.
Yeah, and Nate Schroeder's about 240.
Yeah, no, Nate Schroeder, he was a great fighter. He actually had some of the best fights against Jeremy Horn. I think they fought twice, and he just took it to Jeremy Horn, but Jeremy Horn would survive, and I think he beat him both times right at the end. But yeah, Nate Schroeder was a real good fighter, real good wrestler, big, and athletic. So, I mean, I think he became a cop in Davenport, last I heard. That or maybe a stripper, a grappling stripper.
Maybe you're mixing him up with Kaz Daniels again, man.
Yeah.
But you mentioned the Going Platinum show, the Rome, Georgia show.
Yes.
And you had a real tough fight there. And if I remember correctly, you had a real tough experience on this night because I think they I don't know why, but I think they kept pushing your fight back, and like you were actually like after the main events. Am I wrong? Do I remember that wrong, or is that right?
I don't know if that was a pay-per-view event and that's what happened, but I do know I got on the card real late. Like Monty goes, I finally got you on his card. I'm like, what card? So I actually had to like drive out to Iowa, and then we flew from Iowa up to Minnesota, the connecting flight, and then down to Rome, Georgia. And I got there like that. And I think everybody was there, and I got there that day of the weigh-ins. So I had to like hurry up and lose weight and stuff like that. Um, but I was late, yeah, because I was one of the I think the last fight after me was Jens Pulver and Phil Johns because it was my fight. And I remember I think it was like 2 5-minute rounds only or something like that. It was really or short, but the ring was so big it took like a minute and a half to walk from one corner just to the center of the ring. It was so big. And I just remember it's like it was ours was kind of a boring fight and stuff like that. And then
Let me just clear it up. It's against Paul Rodriguez, who's a veteran, a lifelong martial artist at this point, like yourself, and a real tough guy back then. Quiet guy, didn't say much, but definitely a real tough guy. It looks like it was 3 4-minute rounds, and if I'm not
okay,
mistaken,
that was it.
and I think I judged that fight. I don't remember.
Okay, yeah, it was a boring fight. And then Jens Pulver, Phil Jones, I think he knocked him out in like 15 seconds or something like that.
Yeah,
But the best part of that, because that's where Pat fought Paleolandi, Jose
yeah.
Paleolandi, and he hurt his back and stuff like that. I remember taking him in there. And I remember not having a room because I was put on the card so late. So Monty goes, "Will you just room with Joe Slick and Jeremy Horn?" I'm like, "All right." So I had to room with them. Well, Joe Slick went out drinking or something like that, and Jeremy Horn, I said, "Let's just go to bed. We're tired." And then there was only 2 beds in our room, and so Jeremy Horn's like, "Well, I mean, what's going to happen is if we each pick a bed, Joe Slick's going to crawl in bed with one of us, right? Probably wake one of us up or something like that. He'd be drunk." And he goes, or as one of us said, "Hey, let's just lay in bed together so Joe Slick wakes up none." So we shared a bed that night. And of course, when Joe Slick got in there, he was drunk and he probably like, made fun of us or turned on all the lights. So we woke up anyways. But that was a 3-man room. So another
You,
great night.
yeah, yeah. Monty's got you fully accommodated there. Yeah, Sharon. Yeah, you fought a tough guy too. Everybody there had tough fights though. So
Yeah, no, it was was it Brad Kohler fought? I remember this. And back in the day, these is how where medicals were performed. Brad Kohler fought Babalu, I believe, right?
I'm checking up on that. It's very possible. It was a huge show. Yeah, Babalu and Brad Kohler. Absolutely right.
Yes. And the thing I remember about that was Brad Kohler, like they did medicals, like the blood pressure and who knows what else. But I know they did blood pressure and they checked him and his blood pressure was really high. And I remember him, I don't know if he was popping something like caffeine pills or drinking whatever just to get pumped up for his fight with Bob. So he was all jacked up, ready to go. And I remember, I think it was 2 EMTs or 2 doctors walked in there and said, "Hey, we need to recheck your blood pressure." So, because it was kind of high. And he was like, "No, I'm fine, I'm fine." And you could see he was just all jacked up and stuff like that. And the doctors looked at each other and they said, "Well, if we check it and it's high, we have to do something." And the other doctor's like, "Okay, let's not check it," and walked out. So that's how the medicals were done there. I mean, I know it probably does the same thing like this, but I remember that specifically. I'm like, they're not going to check his medicals because they don't want to tell him he can't fight.
Now Brad got kicked in the head that day.
Yeah, yeah, he gassed out bad, and then he got punted by Babalu.
Yeah, it's pretty funny. It's not a great thing. Oh, he did last. I'm sorry, 50 seconds into the second round. Like if he
Yeah.
gassed 50 seconds, he wasn't going to be in much great shape. There was another one of those Midwest Outlaws on that show. It was a famous show, by the way. But Horn took a loss to Rodrigo Nogueira, big
Oh
nod.
yes, yeah.
A lot of people think Horn won that fight, including I think myself.
Back then there was like that. Oh my gosh, they're Brazilians. They're unbeatable. This and that. So if it was a close fight, you're like, well, of course you have to give it. And from what I remember from that fight, I think Jeremy Horn was on the ground, right? And Rodrigo would not get into his guard. So if you think about that in a fight like that, something like that, where, they're supposed to be so good on the ground and they refuse to get into Horn's ground. I think that shows a lot of respect for Jeremy and his ground game. And he was probably the ultimate, student of the game. He really was the man that studied everything. I mean, he's not the most athletic, and he knew that, but he would study everything and learn everything. And that's what I remember about that fight was that was a lot of respect shown for, Jeremy if Rodrigo's not getting into his guard.
Do I remember correctly? I think in the stand-up, like Horn was timing a head kick and caught him a few times with it too.
Yeah. Jeremy Horn was, and he told me that he used to do head kicks because if he misses or something, they'll end up on the ground, and that's where he wants to be. And he knew he wasn't a good takedown. He couldn't just take people down, so that's why a lot of times I think he used that head kick as part of his plan to get to the ground. Most people are like, oh, don't kick in the head, you might fall and they'll be on top of you. Well, that's what he wanted. So, I mean, he knew his limitations. He was, like I said, he was playing chess while a lot of people were playing checkers.
Yeah, he's a genius, man. I mean, just that's interesting because a lot of people who have bad takedowns try their bad takedowns in fights, but he's that head kicking, that's a great strategy, especially for the early 90s. Now, at some point here, you've beaten a long list of top guys here. At some point, you're starting to, crawl into, the top 10 lists on the world level and stuff like that. When did you start to think about that sort of thing, that you were pretty good on the world level?
I never thought that. I always thought, I just like to compete. My whole idea was to compete. I didn't like to measure myself. I don't like, even now, I don't like to think about that. Even like something like this, when I talk like, oh, talk about your career, I said, I don't like to talk about my career because it seems like, okay, it's over with. And I want to talk about what I was. I just knew that I like to compete and something that I enjoyed. So it wasn't like, oh, I got to do this, I got to do that. No, I did it to compete. And that's why, I never worried about, well, this will help my career. This fight won't. I just took fights, like the whole anywhere, anytime, anything. So even if I was injured, I took fights. So, which looking back, you're not supposed to, but
Yeah, you do. You look back, you'd probably change a few things, but now,
yeah.
let me. Here at some point, like I said, you're one of the guys that is starting to come to the top and stuff. And you had like a pretty serious motorcycle accident. Why don't you tell people about that setback and how that thing affected you? This is circa 1999, right?
Didn't have a motorcycle accident.
What how'd you hurt your neck?
It was probably just overuse or overtime.
I thought it was a motorcycle accident. Why don't you clean it up? Because I know your comeback fight, your return fight after the long layoff was Chris Lytle. So we'll end, talking about that fight. But why don't you take us through? You spent a year laid off.
Yeah, well, I never thought myself as somebody who got injured a lot. But the problem was I would be injured, but I still would fight through it. And what had happened was, like, I would just even having like a cup of tea or something like that, and I'd drink it. If I coughed or like cleared my throat, my hand would go and I'd almost drop the cup. And I'm like, I would lose like strength in my right hand. Even now to this day, my right hand is like my right side is weaker than my left side. And there was a guy here, like, oh, you just need to because I said my neck, it felt like something tore inside my back. It was just a light grapple with some new guys, and it just felt funny. And I kept feeling like something in my back. I kept itching, and it'd go numb, and it just wasn't feeling well. So I probably even fought a couple of times like that, but I couldn't use my right hand or anything. And then that's where they started doing like I went to therapy, like physical therapy and stuff, and they're like, "Oh, is it getting better?" I'm like, "No, it's not. It's and they said, well, we'll do this. And then all of a sudden I MRI, and that one doctor says, you have like a ruptured disc or something like that. You need this fixed. And that was like, well, I mean, how do you fix it? And they're like, well, we drill your hip, we take a bone out, and we fuse your neck together. And I'm like, well, how does that like affect me as a competitor? Because at this point, I'm like, I just want to make the UFC type thing. So they fused my neck together and I was out. So I have a hole in my hip where they drilled it. And this is shortly after that, they stopped doing it. They used titanium, but they just fused my neck together, and I was in a brace, like a neck brace for like a hard brace for 3 months and a soft brace for 6 months or something like that. So nearly a year I had a neck brace without working out or anything. So yeah, I think it was, I don't know if there's one situation. I know exactly when I kind of did it. It was a light roll with the guy, but it wasn't anything hard. So it must have been just over time or something like that. I got that.
That's amazing though. But so now they do it with titanium, and so they drill a piece of your bone out and
Yeah, and that they take a bone to fuse the two vertebrae together. So
okay.
there's like a core of bone, like from my hip, and then they go through the front here and they fuse my neck together. So, and they said, you're not going to have, my movement on my neck is not as good. And like I said, my right hand still is to this day is not strong as my left side. You know what I mean? And I'm right hand dominant. Like when even like when you do like the grip strength and stuff, my right hand doesn't grip very hard. I can't, pick up my right hand or throw my right hand with any much conviction. So it's one of those things that almost like took half my body away from me.
It's
And
crazy.
it wasn't like I said, it just, I guess, overuse or over time, because I know almost the exact time when it happened was just a light roll.
Now, when you say fused, now if you're not sure, it's cool, but a lot of people have more than one bone fused. Do you have two or three, or like what? Do you know? Are you familiar
No,
with those?
I believe they just fuse like C5, C6. I believe my ex-fiance would know. I think they only fused one of those bones, but they said the disc on top is going to get worn and the disc on bottom are going to get worn, just because I don't have the same kind of movement in my neck and my head. And that's why sometimes if you see me, I turn funny. I can't, touch my chin down to my neck. I can't look up as well. I mean, it limits me. And this is, I was a young guy when this happened. I think it was 28, 29 when I think I got fused.
And
Um,
even to be honest with you, even in your later career, when you because you fought a lot afterwards and at a very high level, but even then, like I mean, we're friends. I mean, it's like you had movement, man. Carl dropped you with, you got, or Rami Aram, I think, dropped you with like one, that's not you.
yeah,
You don't like that. So like it affected you your whole career.
yeah, no, it was, and that was the one thing. If you ever look at my right hand, I would throw it, but I knew I wasn't going to try to hit anybody. It's almost like a throw in to get to the clinch. I mean, kind of like you talked to Jeremy Horn. I would get into the clinch. I was really good at the clinch. You know what I mean? And that's what I'd get into that, and I would throw that not to hit somebody or even knock it out, but because I used to have. I mean, when I boxed, I could punch, but when I got in there with that hand, or I broke my hand too, but with the neck, I mean, even like baseball, I think when I was 27, 28, whenever I got fused together, my brother and I, we went to, like, state fair or something. He was probably like 12 years old and he could throw the baseball faster than me. And it was like my arm would hurt. I couldn't throw it. It was like so weak, but it probably did affect me a lot more than I thought.
Yep. Now, at some point though, you even with the braces and shit, you didn't give up. You said you were going to come back and compete because you did.
Yes.
How did that come about? Because those Randy Greenman shows in St. Louis or in the Boondocks there in Missouri are legendary shows, and he put together massive fights, including your return fight against Chris Lytle, two UFC level dudes.
Yeah. No, that was those ones that just called me up and I said, yeah, I'll do it. And, you know, I actually think I promoted a show like a day or two after. I think that was on a Thursday night, and I might have done a show after that. So I was, I also knew as a businessman, I knew that, you know, you can promote a lot longer than you can fight. I learned that from watching like people like Monty Cox and other like Tom Latuli and stuff like that. You can promote a lot longer than you can fight. Your fighting career is a very short window. So that's why I started like, well, I need training partners here in Kenosha, as well as like a business model. And thinking about that, the training partners would come from guys who would compete. And I think competing makes the best fighters. Training is great and stuff like that, but the more they compete, I think the better they get at it. And I think Jeremy Horn's a perfect example. I mean, he traveled around the country, 2, 3 fights a night. I remember he'd be able to drive somewhere, get a fight on a Friday night, drive somewhere else and get a Saturday night, like small little shows. And it wasn't like high level competitions, but just getting into the ring and doing things that you want to test out in an opponent that's not a training partner and under live fire, I think made Jeremy Horn one of the best fighters ever through a process of evolution, not just because he trained a lot, but he competed a lot. And I think that made him.
Yeah, no, I agree. And your guys were modeled after. I was going to ask you, was it around this time with the injury too that you became freestyle, academy and the freestyle combat championships and stuff? Talk about the evolution of that because a lot of the guys from the next era after you were affected by you and your group. You either as competition or you had a strong group there.
Yeah. So as I was still in my neck brace and stuff like that, I remember Brett Alazawi came and wanted to live and train here. So he came and lived with us for a while to train. He was kind of upset because I couldn't train with him. I said, look, I got my neck like this. And like even like sleeping, I had to like sleep sitting up sometimes, like in a papasan chair because I couldn't lay my head back and stuff like that. But he trained, and that's where I'm like, well, you know what? I'm gonna start promoting shows to get more fighters to fights. And I actually promoted some in like here in Kenosha, I promoted some as well as in Twin Lakes, Wisconsin, and then I moved up to Racine, Wisconsin, and started promoting shows up there. So that's when we did the Freestyle Combat Challenge, we called it. And we call it Extreme Brawl. First time I had a partner, John Principe, and stuff like that. We started that way, and then I kind of went another way and got this Freestyle Combat Challenge and with grappling matches and stuff like that. Um, but that was when I started promoting and realizing that my career is going to be short ended, especially with this major injury and stuff like that. And so that's why I started promoting more. And we got a lot of like doctors in the area that were really big in the UFC to back us. Dr. Main, Dr. Walrod, Dr. Passarelli and stuff like that. So we had a really good support system. And it just grew from there and got really big. And it was probably one of the premier places. Like we used to go take on American Top Team. We'd bring them up or go down there with them. So that's
Yeah.
when but it started out small and just kind of feeling it out and going from there.
Now let me ask you, and we'll go back around. We don't need to go completely in order, but at the end, it got big, the freestyle, and then all of a sudden you had a guy you mentioned earlier in this interview start popping up in the area, another big school, Duke Rufus, and stuff like that, and that became a rivalry too. Talk about that and the influence, and then also, the the boxing commissions.
Yeah, Duke Rufus came to one of my shows and stuff like that, and then him being a business person said, hey, this is the way to make money and stuff like that. So because he used to do kickboxing shows, and then he'd do kickboxing shows and he'd add 1 or 2 mixed martial art fights on it. So he kind of introduced it that way, and now he did that for a while, and for a while Wisconsin. This is why I was so against this whole boxing commission coming in there. Wisconsin, you could have a fight in Kenosha, in Racine, in Milwaukee, in Green Bay, in La Crosse, all across the state, and it wasn't affected. Nobody was affected or anything like that. Once a boxing commission came, I think they wanted to limit. No, you can only have one event per weekend or something because they need the commissioners there and you need licensed judges and refs. It's like it kind of ruined it for all these smaller shows. And that's where I think Wisconsin for a while was the hotbed. I mean, we had guys from Madison making the fights and stuff like that. I mean, Red Schaefer was from up in Fond du Lac, I think he started.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that was the golden age of MMA here. I mean, we had, I think we had one time we had like 8 guys from our gym in the UFC or WEC, which was a big one back then too. We had a really good team, and once the commission came, I knew it just kind of crush everything. So
do you blame the commissioners more than that? What was the rivalry with Duke? Because I know that, like, that were you just being grumpy, or was there something to it?
No, it's not a case of being grumpy, and that's people always say, oh, it's like feeling bad, but the thing about that was Duke Rufus was going to be in the back pocket with the boxing commission. He was pushing for a commission, and he said, "Oh no, it's good. This is going to be good. This is good. It's not going to be good for everybody." I mean, they'd always tell you, "Well, when the UFC comes, it generates $40 million. So they come once every 5 years or whatever to Milwaukee. All the money either stays with the UFC or in the Milwaukee area. They're going to get Milwaukee hotels. There's going to be no stuff." And I argued. I said, "Look, we did 4 or 5 shows a year here in Kenosha, Racine, and people would get local hotels. They go to local bars for the after fight party. Most were local fighters, so they got paid after that. And there was a local, the local venues were making money and stuff like that. So it was all a local thing. It made money. Yes, we generate probably about, I would always argue, about $20,000 to $30,000, depending on like after fight, for the local economy, 4 or 5 times a year. That's $100,000 a year, roughly, right? Now you add that, like I just said, 6, 7, 8 different cities doing that. Every little city got a bump in that thing. Well, the UFC, oh, they're going to generate $5 million. Yeah, but everything's going with them, or it's all staying in the Milwaukee area. People didn't say, "Oh, let's go down to Kenosha to the after fight party." No, nobody would. People would go there and it'd be drained there, and that's what I argued. And I know that Duke Rufus was kind of like probably friends with them and kind of was in the back pocket and pushing it and stuff like that. And I know businessmen have to think about their own thing, but that was the one case I think that I mean, I'm sure he's never going to say that, but that's just, it's not good business for all the other fighters. You know what I mean?
And
It,
to add to that, there's Duke obviously he's got a world class gym and a world class trainer and that reputation and stuff. Now, more power to him. But when he was in kickboxing, he really shit all over MMA. Really, and now all of a sudden he jumps in. Was that a little part of it too? It's like what
well,
do you?
if you get down to it, I was out there when he fought Andy Hoog in kickboxing, and I was so excited. Oh, it's another guy. He's from Milwaukee. I'm from Milwaukee. And I met that, and I met him like by the weigh-ins, and I said, "Hey, I'm from Milwaukee too." And he kind of like blew me off, like he was so much better. And I'm like, you're a heavyweight. Heavyweights aren't that good. And Rick Rufus was a good kickboxer. He was the better of the two kickboxers. Duke wasn't a very good kickboxer. Duke was just the guy right behind people and stuff like that. So it's not like he was ever the best kickboxer. And then as far as training goes, I would argue that he's not that good of a trainer. I'm not saying that you can't learn stuff and stuff like that. People are going to argue and say, "Oh, that's just sour grapes." It's not. It's what I mean. I would say Red Shaver is a much better trainer because Red Shaver was in he's in there. He's fighting and stuff like that. Even if it was kickboxing and stuff like that, he would fight and stuff. I mean, behind the scenes, I know his reputation as a kickboxer wasn't that good. It was
Yeah.
not, what I mean? Plus, they're
Well,
heavyweights.
that's a big conundrum in the sport because there are a lot of successful trainers. And Greg Jackson gets accused of that are, you know, they have their level of success and they have guys that they teach or that they've trained that, win championships and stuff. But there also is an undercurrent of guys that say, man, they didn't fight. They never fought. And there is a little bit of that question. It's like two camps in the MMA world.
Yeah, I mean, those who fought. I mean, I always take the sport of wrestling. Wrestling is a hard sport. And if you ever watch wrestling, the guys who, they celebrate when they win a gold medal, the guys take silver, bronze, there are times those guys are so good and they don't even medal. They do those world championships and stuff. I mean, Tom Erickson's a great idea. People say, well, you were second place to Bruce Baumgartner all those years. Second place, like gold medalist, 3-time gold medalist or whatever. That's good. I mean, had he not been there, I mean, it's like He was
John
that good.
Morrison is probably the second greatest super heavyweight in American history behind Baumgartner.
Yeah, and that's where it's like, but they know the work put in and stuff like that, and that's why it's hard to be like, it's hard to be mad at people who did it and never made it top. You know what I mean? There are so many good fighters that, especially when you look at from like lightweight to 170 and stuff like that, which is probably a much tougher weight class than heavyweight, because they had to know how to wrestle. They had to know how to do jujitsu. They had to know how to do striking. They had to know clinch fighting. They had to know all that stuff. And so that's why the one thing I have about heavyweights is that they don't have to know everything. I mean, there are guys who are like, I mean, I don't want to crap on people, but there was a heavyweight that was a champion for years. And I would argue that Matt Hughes could beat him.
yeah,
And Matt Hughes was 170-pound champion. And or even like BJ Penn probably could have beat him. And I mean, the best, because that's why if you're a really good athlete, like a super athlete and stuff like that, you still had to know stuff. I mean, Laverne Clark was a super athlete. He was a great fighter. He was a great wrestler, but he had to learn the technique and stuff like that, or you'd get caught in submissions, and it showed. But if he was 260 pounds, he would have just probably walked through some of those guys. If he was 6'5", 260 with that type of athleticism, and that's why it's like, I said, I argued that LeBron James could have been a heavyweight for a while when there was like an unathletic heavyweight up there. And people say, oh, no, he'd have to learn this. No, he wouldn't. He's 6'8", 260, could jump and just knee in the head every time, or,
yeah,
super athletic. I mean, those are your best athletes for heavyweight are in NBA or in NFL. And yes, they'd have to learn some technique, but it wouldn't take as much years to take it as, being 155 or 170 or something like that. I mean, Brian
yeah.
Garrett is one of the best fighters I've ever seen, knowing everything. And maybe he cracked the top 20 or something like that, maybe in his career, I mean, in top 20, top 50, those guys are good. And that's why there's that level of respect. If you did it and even made it up to the top 20, top 25, top 50 at that weight is good. But you look at heavyweights and it's like, that they didn't, they're there for a reason. Maybe they got really good punching power or a good wrestler, but that's it. You know what I mean? It's not all of it. And that's where I think that people who didn't fight have that kind of like stigmatism that they don't kind of know how hard you really had to put in or how much you really had to know to get there. And like I said, I don't want to sound like sour grapes and poo-hooing things, but
No, in the old podcast with Chris Lytle said the same thing. Heavyweights is a completely different playing field. First of all, they're not that deep. You're the competition level, et cetera, et cetera. So you're absolutely right. Now, before we stray a little bit, why don't we talk about one of your students that you had at the very beginning, and he was a heavyweight, and that's Ben Rothwell. He's still around. He's actually doing bare knuckle at this point. Why don't you talk about meeting a young Ben Rothwell? He's
Ben came to me, I think he was like 16 or something like that, saying he wanted to be the youngest fighter ever. And he was pissed that Vitor Belfort was the youngest champion or whatever he wanted to be. So that was his thing. And I remember telling him, okay. And I pushed, I said, well, you got to make sure you do your schoolwork. Because I asked him how school's going. He's like, oh, school's not for me. I said, I can't let you in here for schoolwork. And he actually turned his schoolwork around. His mom said, I don't know what you did to him, but he's going to school. He's not acting up. So, he came to me telling me what he wanted to do and, actually being able to follow through. So he could follow through. He's a young kid and stuff like that, immature in some ways. But, if he knew what he wanted to do, he could follow through. But he would come to the gym and stuff like that. And he moved well. And I always say, if you're a heavyweight, if you can move well and be athletic, you can have success in that. And like I said, because heavyweights, what I mean, they're kind of limited. I mean, but yeah, he was one of my students and stuff like that.
Now, Ben, you said he moved well. How big was he when he walked in there? Because he's massive. Was he already cutting down or was he over 265? I know you didn't have to cut at that point, but Is he that huge at 16, 17?
He probably was 240, 250 maybe. He was tall. I mean, like I said, I don't remember exactly weights. He probably didn't even have weight classes and stuff like that. Um, but he was, he was somebody who moved well. He's probably about 6'4", whatever he is now. Maybe he's a little shorter than he grew a little bit. But yeah, he was big. I'd guess 240, maybe 250, I guess, when he first walked in. Um, and he at first he would train well and stuff like that, but then it was one of those situations. I think that it was one of those times that I always said that you kind of have to be on your own. And he wanted me to be his only trainer and go to all his fights and only work with him. I said, you got to give these other people chances. I mean, I can't just work with one person right now. I'll be, oh, he's a heavyweight. He could take you. He could get you places. I'm like, you know, short term, maybe. I'm not going to like sell myself out and just do it for that. I mean, and that's why it was one of those situations. He went out to Rothwell, no love lost, no problem. Go do it. I actually wanted him to do that because of his own fighter, and he did. He started his own gym and stuff like that, so it was great.
Now, you mentioned Brian Garrity. He went, he's another guy who fought, 50 fights. I'm going to call it the half century club here, but his high point was the UFC stuff. Why don't you talk about, Brian Garrity going into the Tough Show and things like that, and your influences on him. And then you had a couple other guys, I think, that went to the Tough Show. So we'll go through some of those lists of people there that some of these characters that you had are just fascinating.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So Brian Garrity came to me, and he was so green that when he came to me, he had never worn a cup before. He actually was wearing the cup like backwards. And I'm not saying like upside down, but it was like almost like an innie. And and it was one of those situations I didn't know what to say because he seemed so happy to be part of our team and wrestling. And I didn't know what to say, so I was just kind of putting it off. And even Nick Thompson's like, Dave, you should say something. And I'm like, I'd be like, hey, buddy. And he goes, yeah, am I doing good? And it was like he was like light up. He was so happy to be there. I'm like, I don't want to break his heart, so I just let it go. And he goes, Dave, you have to say something. And so I'd always try to go, buddy, hey, buddy, and finally I was able to say, hey, look, maybe we should try the cup the other way. And that's, kind of how we first kind of got into it and stuff like that. So it was one of those situations that it started off kind of awkward, and Nick Thompson was kind of making fun of him, but they kind of got along. And once we got the cup straightened out, I think his career kind of took off.
You're fucking hilarious, dude. I'm gonna try to have the editor mix in here some of your technique videos with Garrity so people understand what we're talking about here. I mean, the bottom line is there's a good humor in there, and it may not come across to everybody. So it's fucking hilarious. You mentioned Nick Thompson. Now, this is a serious position here because, as a trainer, you guys Nick was rising through Bodog, doing well, picking up wins. And, we had Eddie Alvarez there as a champion. And, Nick put the first loss on Eddie's record, and Nick took his belt at Bodog. And I believe that you deserve some credit for that there was, that you guys had spotted him for a few shows and you were doing your homework and paying attention. Why don't you talk about that process of Nick, going from, a guy who likes to get drunk, before and after fights and, not taking it seriously to a guy who beat Eddie Alvarez, a UFC champion.
Well, Nick Thompson came to us through because we had Pat O'Malley and Ron Faircloth coming down from and those are two dedicated guys. They would come down there every Tuesdays and Thursdays from Madison, which is about an hour and a half drive, and they would come down there all the time. They even came down here. There was a guy from Minnesota Vikings, Corey something, who died once because it was like 95 degrees. And I remember them coming to train, and I remember Ben Rothwell being there, and Ben's like, hey, there's a football player that just died. You're going to have us train right now in 95-degree weather? I'm like, yeah, we're not playing football. We'll be fine. So, and when we train, it'd be hot in there. It'd probably be like 110 degrees in there. But Nick Thompson came down with him, and he had the wrestling skills and stuff like that. But he didn't have the jujitsu skills or anything like that. And one of his first fights, I don't know which one, was that guy from American Top Team.
Dustin Dennis.
Yes. And, you know, they're like, well, we're going to put him against him. And being like, Dave, he's going to get killed. I'm like, no, he's going to be fine. He can defend a takedown. And so we just practice. Keep your jab out there. You're long. You're a big 170 or what? I think it was like 180. Maybe that fight was at or whatever it was. I said you're gonna keep the jab and just focus on the jab, keeping him off you. Don't worry about anything. And I remember because he had to cut for that fight. And I remember being down in Florida and everybody else had made weight. And you're like, Dave, Nick Thompson has to make weight. And I'm like, shoot, all right. So I went to the hotel. I said, Nick, what's going on? And he was sitting there playing Madden on his PlayStation or Genesis or whatever game system it was. And he's like, Dave, I can't cut any more weight. I quit. I said, no, you're fine. So I got into the bathroom with him and, turned the shower on to cut weight, and we cut the weight. And so, he made the weight. We got in there and stuff like that. And, it showed that he's got all the skills. I mean, he did things in that match that you're not supposed to. And that's the one thing that I never try to correct some fighters, even though if they did some things a little bit different. I don't remember that fight. I think Dustin got him down or something. And instead of trying to pull a guard, because I'm like, you're not going to learn how to pull guard and work a guard against a guy who's so good in jiu-jitsu. And I would just sit up like you're doing in wrestling. And he kept doing that. And Dustin was like, kind of surprised, like, this is not what you're supposed to do. And I'm like, well, we can't do what we're supposed to do because you do it better. And that was the one thing I let people kind of find the system. It's a martial art. You kind of have to do some things that other guys don't know, especially if they're going to be better at that. So I think that the way we train was not so much like, oh, we teach them what to do. Like, no, we don't. We let them find their way. And that was the one thing I think that I try to do with everybody. I don't say, you got to do it this way, do it this way. We give them suggestions and stuff like that, but let them kind of figure out different ways of getting out. And I think, like I said, I learned a lot from Jeremy Horn that way because we said, well, what about this? And we try it. And then he goes, no, I don't like that. Or, yeah, that's not a bad thing, or different things like that. So we would come up with techniques and I'd always like, look, you guys are younger than me. You guys are more flexible. You guys can get away with things that I can't. So that's why the one thing that I think that we always did. And I like the term Freestyle Academy because it became your jujitsu, not my jujitsu, yours. You can do things I can do things you can't. We'll give you the basic techniques, but when you come down to the funk and stuff like that, I think Nick was one of those guys that kind of took it and ran, and instead of just doing what we told him, he kind of found his way. And
now against Alvarez, you just kept him at the end of the jab though, and that sounds like you and your game plan.
Yes, that's exactly what it is. Keep him at the end of the jab because I said he's going to have a hard time taking you down, and if he does, he's going to get tired. He doesn't know how big you are. He's not cutting. He's a walk around at 170, and that's going to wear him down, and it's going to be frustrating. And people who end the fight, a lot of those guys who end quickly and stuff like that, end the fights quick, that they're not used to. They're thinking, oh my gosh, you went past the first round, I'm losing. Even if he wasn't losing, I said he's going to think he's losing if it goes past a minute or 2 minutes. And one of the things that when I always tell those people, I said, don't ever tell a guy you're going to kill this guy, you're going to beat him, because what happens is mentally, if you don't kill him, pretty soon they get in their head like, oh my gosh, I'm losing. And it kind of plays games with them, even if they're winning, but not winning as convincingly or as fast as they want. I think that that's the one thing that, I don't like telling people, oh, you're going to win. It's just, I just want to get them, the fighters, that whatever your next move is, I mean, if they take you down, what are we doing? If you take them down, what are we doing? You're just your next move. I'm not worried about, oh, they took you down. They shouldn't take you down. You should have done that. No, you just got to go on what your next move is. And so I think that's the one thing that when we worked with Thompson and stuff like that, or everybody, it's just Thompson, was, like, especially Eddie Alvarez, you're going to take him down. If he does take you down, that's going to be a load on him. Just work yourself back up. Don't worry about submitting him, or just get yourself back up. These are the ways you do it. Find your way, even if it's a little funky or something. He's smaller than you, and we knew that would play a factor.
How much did Thompson weigh? I know he made 170, obviously, but how much did he weigh come fight time?
That's a good question. I don't know how much he cut from. Certain people, I don't know if they can sweat more or cut more. He could cut, I don't know exactly, he would know better what he cut from. But he was a guy that would go down like from a lot of weight. And Jamil Masu was another guy that could cut a lot of weight. And there's some other guys that just couldn't. Like Brian Garrity, like he had to be within so many pounds, I think, fight time. He just wasn't as comfortable or didn't sweat as much, or not exactly sure, how it was, but he was one of those guys that didn't cut as well.
Now, Garrity went to the TV show. He's probably the best fighter you sent there, but you also sent a couple of other guys. I think at least Solomon Hutcherson deserves a mention. Talk about Solomon. Solo man.
Whatchamacallit, Brian Garrity because like we tried to like get in the first TV show, we're filming and stuff. And I'm like, you guys, this is not the way to do it. You're saying, hey, I would bring this to, they had videos of us fighting, and then they'd be like, I would be a really good asset to the thing. And it was really boring. I'm like, you guys, me filming this is just boring. We got to do something different. And Brian, actually being very creative and stuff, came up with this like whole storyline, how he was like getting beat up in the street and this and that. And I was like kind of interviewing him. It was real funny. And it kind of like somebody was able to piece it together. It looked really good. And that's how he got on. But Solomon Hutcherson had the best, like, to get on the show, because like they're saying, hey, we're looking for 185 pounders. And I called Solomon Hutcherson, look, they're 185 pounders. They're looking for it. We need you to film some. And he was working, I think, doing like tarring or concrete or something. So he just came in with like his work clothes, work clothes, like, dirty jeans and a shirt and stuff like that. So we got to film something. And it was him and Rob Roy. Like they were just going back at it, like just freestyle, like, and then like slam each other and yell and talk to the camera. And like, like I said, and Solomon Hutcherson has some big wins. I think he knocked out John Fitch, and it was call it no contest. But he was so good at just like that freestyle rapping and talking and trash. And whatchamacallit, Rob Roy is trying to stay with him on that. And Rob Roy was a little bit quieter and had a different sense of humor, but it was so like perfect. I just filmed it, didn't edit it, and I sent it in. And Solomon got picked for that. And like I said, he was a good fighter. He was a good wrestler, and he had that funky style and stuff like that. He was good. Him and Rob Smith, probably one of the best first rounds ever we had in our show up in Racine. So
I remember somebody got his back in Florida, and he did like a rolling front cartwheel with the guy on his back and stuff. So yeah, a real good athlete and a natural on camera. Solomon is a guy that is definitely worthy of some remembering there. Now, you mentioned Rob Roy. Now, explain this, because for a long time on Sherdog, there was Rob Roy, and then there was Sharon Leggett. And now it turns out that Rob Roy is Sharon Leggett, or Sharon Leggett, Rob Roy. What's the deal?
Well, where that came from, the whole thing is like he showed up to my gym one day. I forgot why he showed up. Maybe it was because he was like trading Pokemon cards or something, because he was always into business type stuff. And I was buying a new gym right down the street where I was going to buy the old thing, and I was seeing it or something. I talked to him and I saw him, and he like had a way of talking that was kind of like a mumble type thing. And I said, he goes, do you wrestle? I said, yeah, we have it. He goes, well, I want to wrestle. I said, well, come to the gym and stuff like that. And then Brian Garrity's like, hey, make him wear a singlet. I'm like, all right. So he wore his singlet the first couple of times, you know what I mean? And he was a pretty good wrestler. He was kind of out of shape when he first came, but he wanted to do it. So, we're kind of showing him what to do. And like Tuesday, Thursdays when Faircloth would come down, and Pat O'Malley from Madison and Nick Thompson from Madison, they were coming there. And and a lot of times I don't like ask people name, or I just remember it, or I have to give them a nickname just because there's so many of it. And then he was grappling, and Faircloth's like, hey, what's your name, or something like that. And he was like grappling, and he's like it's Sharon, but call me Rob. And he's like, Rob? He goes, Ron. He said, Ron or Rob? And he's like, Dave, is it Ron or Rob? I said, it's Rob Roy. Because like you didn't know which one. So it's Rob Roy. So from that moment we just started calling him Rob Roy. Um, and then that's when later on we had the Sergio Gomez was going to be on the Tap Out show. They were coming to film Sergio Gomez, and Mask was asking me, hey, is there another guy? We have to film another one from here. And I said, oh, just pick Rob Roy. He's kind of a character, and that's where he got into Superman mask and kind of created Rob Roy, the superhero and stuff like that, and kind of ran with it.
Yeah,
But his
and
name
now,
was Sharon Leggett.
yeah, and now on Sure Dog, Sharon Leggett's record is combined with Rob Roy, but yeah, at
It's
some
the
point
same guy.
he was booking himself with both names and stuff. And he's one of those guys that was, exciting. He put on his little show and stuff, but he didn't keep a perfect record and stuff. So he might lose a fight under one name and fight the next day under another name.
Yeah,
That kind of.
no, but he had the greatest weight cut that I've ever seen, and it was out in New Jersey. I don't know who he fought or what he fought in New Jersey. We had him fight out there, and he was fighting some guy, and he had a hard time cutting weight, and he got the weight cut, and I think with his clothes on or underwear, he was like 0.1 or 0.2 over. And I said, hey, it's wet clothes, he's got wet underwear on, stuff like that. Can we just give it to him? Right? Because you could see he was drained and stuff like that. And the guy said, no, we can't give it to him. You know what I mean? The opponent, because the doctor said, we can do it if you want. And the opponent said, nope, don't want it. He's got to cut that weight. And so it was like those trainers and the guy sitting there. And so Rob Roy just put his stuff on and just started running around the room. And he would just stare at the guy the whole time, just not look away from the guy. He would run right by the guy and just stare at him. And he did that 10, 15, just emotionless, nothing. Just looked at him, got on there, made weight, left. I didn't say anything. And then while we're driving back in the thing, he started like chugging. I said, slow down, you can't. And he was just chugging, what the heck was that? Pedialyte or something like that. Just not, I said, you got to slow down. You know what I mean? And he gets out of the van and he just pukes like all this Pedialyte and it was probably glorious that he did that. But like I said, just that whole stare down while he was running, I thought was the best thing I've ever seen. I mean,
that was that was against Deborah Nardu, who
yeah,
later on your guy Nick Aguilar avenged
yeah,
in Costa Rica when you were playing Tiger.
Tiger Man. Yeah.
So talk about your UFC experience. When you went in there, you got the call early in one of the early UFCs, UFC 40 something.
44.
And I'll get it right here. Yeah, UFC 44. And they pulled you in. They had a lot of Iowa guys, a lot of wrestler guys. I don't think they knew what they were getting, but they pulled you in for a fight they wanted you to lose, I think. And that was because they had an undefeated guy from California named Rami Aram that had a big reputation, a king of the cage guy. Why don't you talk about how that whole fight came about and how you felt, before the fight and then after?
Well, for that fight, I do know that, I didn't have anything scheduled and it was just hard for me to find things. I mean, I even won some tournament in Indiana and everybody on that show, and that was where I was still getting injured and stuff like that. And I'm like, I just got to get a big fight, just almost like legitimize my career. You know what I mean? I mean, big fights in the U.S. is different than like big fights on pay-per-view. So I remember fighting there once, and I think 7 guys got fights in Japan. Monty booked 7 guys from that fight. And I said, Monty, I won the tournament. How come I didn't get booked? And he goes, oh, I think you run too quick or, something like that. So that was one of those situations I'm like, I got to do something. You know what I mean? I'll like I said, I just want to make it. You know what I mean? Just making it once kind of, I think, would justify, okay, he's good. You know what I mean? Regardless of, oh, no, he won around the Midwest. Yeah, that's different than fighting internationally or on pay-per-view or UFC type thing. So that was my whole goal, to make it there. And that's why it's like, once I made it there, it was almost like I didn't care about the fights anymore. I just wanted to preserve my body. But I think the night I got the fight, we were down in, I don't know if I fought or not, but I was down at the Hook and Shoot in Indiana, and Chris Lytle fought, who's like Aaron Riley. And I think Aaron Riley was booked to fight Romy Aram, because I think that's what you told me. Or I remember that was the next fight coming up, and Chris Lytle knocked him out. And then it was that moment that I think you told me or somebody told me, okay, I think you can get into UFC now. And that's where they gave me Romy Aram. And someone's like, oh, there's a big article that, Romy Aram's going to fight for a title after he beats you. I'm like, well, he's got to beat me first. I know, but you're 33 years old. I mean, you don't really, I mean, at that point, you can't build, at that age, you can't build, oh, yeah, this is the future. It's like, no, you're the end type thing. So I figured, well, I'm going to go for it all. I'm going to put everything out there. And I remember to get ready for that fight, I was just training real hard, real hard. And one time, like, everybody's leaving. And I remember like sitting there, I'm like, all right, bye guys. And I couldn't raise my right arm. And I said, you guys, I can't raise my right arm. And this one guy goes, yeah, you can. He picked up and he pulled it up. And I said, yeah, you can lift it, but I can't. And what happened was like my neck, where it'd been fused and stuff, I don't know if it was swollen or something. It was pushing against something that I couldn't raise my hand. So I had to go to a doctor and stuff. And they had to like give me shots into my neck. Like I had to lay face down, and they had to do like an X-ray into my back and put a shot into the disc to, I guess, alleviate it or keep the swelling down. And it was that moment in my training that I felt I could go at a certain speed, but if I went faster, like the wheels would start coming off. Like it start, how you have those old cars that, oh yeah, it drives fine when you're on a city street, 30, 35 miles an hour. You get on the expressway, 50, 55, it's okay. Anything like that, it feels like it's going to fall apart. And I felt that with my body that I could go at a certain pace or a certain thing, but I had to stop, because if I went any longer, it would just fall apart. And that's where it was one of those situations that I knew I had to get ready. I had to do this. And, knowing my neck injury and stuff, I said, well, I got to do it. You know what I mean? And it was one of those situations. I was in good shape and stuff like that, but I knew I couldn't go at the pace I wanted to. So build up to that fight was, everyone's like, oh my gosh, Dave, they think they're going to beat you. I'm like, I don't care. I'm doing it. I'm going to go out. And that was the fight that I did it. So.
Yeah. Now he dropped you in the first minute, like, and I remember that you smiled at him when you got up. Talk about your memory of the actual in-ring stuff.
I remember Joe Silva called me, and this is the whole beginning of the UFC. It still wasn't quote unquote mainstream. They wanted to make it exciting, and Joe Silva had called me up. That was a matchmaker and stuff. He goes, "We're giving you this fight, but if you make it boring, even if you win, we're never having you on again, or any of your." It's just something like never have any of your guys. So I'm like, all right, I got to keep standing. I have to stand the whole time. That's my whole idea, is that I'm going to stand with them. And so when I was doing that, what happened was he threw a punch and I was backing away. Like I didn't get caught flush with that right hand. I was backing away from it, but my right foot caught the mat, and that's what kind of dropped me. So it wasn't like a hard, and I went down. I just kind of like, you know what I mean? I'm like, it's nothing. And then all of a sudden he started like, laying all these punches, and they weren't landing or nothing. And that's why I'm like, I have to do something. So I went for an arm bar, if you remember, and he got pulled out, and I just kind of rolled out and got up. I'm like, all right, no big deal. I'm back to my feet. And that's when I like shot in that one time, and he is a big guy. I didn't realize how big he was. I mean, I don't know what he cut from, but he was just a big guy. Like, so then I'm like, all right, I got to do something else and just shoot and take him down. And that's where I threw that right hand. If you remember the fight, threw the right hand. Understand, I'm just going to kind of like back, and I caught his neck, and I like did a duck under, swing to his back, just because it's one of those things that I like to do. And I swung, and it like took him down. And I went right into the mount off the thing. So I like threw my feet, knowing exactly what I was trying to do. And then that's when I got on the mount, landed some punches. He good jujitsu and stuff like that. So he got up. So just new punching. I just had to punch. I wasn't going for like a ground out and ground and pound. So it was like, we get up and stuff like that. And I think he threw a right hand and he didn't punch hard. He was tired from his first thing. I knew that, but he never was a hard puncher. So I wasn't worried. So when he did hit me that once, that's when I did, oh, okay, come on, I'm okay. But again, I could throw jabs or a right hand really light. I couldn't throw the big right hand. And that's why it was one of those things like, oh, you didn't punch hard. I'm like, I used to be able to punch hard, but I broke my hand. I actually broke my hand when I was supposed to fight Adrian Serrano again. I was training for Militich. I actually broke my hand, and I have 2 plates and 16 screws in the one hand, my right hand. That's why I can't. That was the one time they said, okay, we fixed it. You break it again, we'll never be able to fix it again because you can't. And that's why I never want to throw my right hand either. Another reason. Um, so it was one of those things that I never punch with my right hand that hard because I knew if I break it, I never use it. So, um, but that was the thing. I won that decision and stuff like that. And that was the one that we were the what they call it, the swing bout or something like that.
Yeah.
Everybody's got their time, but if it ends early or something like that, they're gonna stick us in. And so we were like warming up probably for like 2 hours because you had to be ready. They could say you're up next. So we were constantly just light warming up and stuff like that. And all of a sudden, okay, you're up, you're up. And then when they call us out there, I was supposed to go first, but Romy Aram. So they introduced him as Dave Strasser and me as Romy Aram. Um, but it was one of those situations that was like, and I knew nothing was going to bother me because people, I think somebody was in my corner, Pat O'Malley or someone's like, it's not, this is Dave Strasser. I'm like, don't worry. Who cares what they announce us? We're going to go out there, we're going to fight. So,
Yeah.
and then afterwards, if you saw us, that was when Pat O'Malley made me do the shocker. So I was doing the shocker on pay-per-view TV. But I
That's
guess I
cool.
did it wrong.
Yeah, that would be you. But so now you had a nice win, and I remember Joe Rogan saying, how tough you are and stuff like that. So you made a good impression on the general public and stuff. They bring you back to fight Caro. Now this isn't an easy fight, and then you never come back to the UFC. Talk about that whole experience.
Um, well, the thing about that, if you remember the fight with Romy Aram, in the middle of the second or third round, I like stepped back funny. And even Joe Rogan said, oh, wait, what happened? What happened? It was either Joe Rogan or Phil Baroni. I think that's who the announcers were. They said, oh, I think he's hurt. I think he's hurt because I stepped funny. And you know what I mean? Because I like leaned back or like I had like a weird thing. And I remember it was between the second and third round. I was sitting in a corner and the doctor or corner person came up to me and said, how's your knee? And my one knee, I had pads on both knees because my left knee was like, I had 2 surgeries on it. So it was kind of acting up. I said, my knee's fine. And the guy grabs my right knee. He goes, no, this one. And I thought it was like the weirdest thing. Like, why is he asking me this? I mean, like right in the middle of the fight. I'm like, no, I'm fine. But what happened was that's where I think this whole hip problem I have now kind of started because it was after that that I would like have hip pain. Like it was almost like in the middle of my thigh, not like my hip, but it was like the middle of my thigh. And I couldn't like run as hard as I wanted to because there was just some kind of like pain to it. So going into the fight with Carl, like it was only like 6 months later or something like that. It wasn't that long. My leg was killing me. Like I couldn't run, I couldn't do it. So I did more lifting and stuff like that. And I actually had a harder time cutting weight because I couldn't run. And then it was at that point in my career that remember my whole goal was just to make it to the UFC and I mean, get to that point. That was my kind of my goal. I was 34, I think, when I fought Carl. So I was like, okay, I made it, but it's like, okay, let's just see how far this runs. But then again, once you get in your head, okay, you made that. I didn't train as much, and my fear was to get thrown on my head. That was my whole fear because of my neck and my leg was hurt. And I remember that, and it was like, gosh, they're giving me a guy that's going to throw me on my head. I know he's that good at judo, and it was almost like I fought real cautiously, and I can defend judo throws. I can do it, but it was like I was so scared that I remember I stopped it the first time, and then if you remember the fight, I like had the worst shot ever. I just shot in, and like without even trying to get in because I didn't want to like shoot in or anything like that, hurt my neck. And I pulled guard and he went for an ankle lock. I got out of that. We got back to our feet, and that's when he hit the first throw. That's when I landed right on my head. And I'm like, exactly what I didn't want to happen. That was the one thing I didn't want. I just remember that. And after that, I'm like, gosh, I just don't want to get caught again or something like that. And then he caught me on that arm bar though. And like I said, it was at the end of the fight. It was he didn't have my head held down. I could have sat up and done other things. But the whole idea was like, you know what? I'm not injured. You know what I mean? I don't want to get injured. That was the whole idea. And that's where it's like I think I fought with a different mindset. I didn't care about the winning at all costs. It was almost like self-preservation type thing.
Now, here's the thing, though. You're 34 years old. You're being realistic. You got to the UFC. It's kind of what the goal was. You wanted to do that. And, the Carl loss, now you're out of the UFC. Now, a lot of people would have called it quits there. But, you continued to fight. The fact of the matter is, at the very least, your next 4 fights are all against UFC level people,
Mhm.
Ansar Chalangov in Russia. A lot of people won't remember him, but he was, one of those leg lock specialists. And Pat Healy, who did the UFC. After that, the next fight, George St. Pierre, only, a lot of people's choice for GOAT. It's like that's that doesn't sound like you were like, well, I made the UFC, I've done what I wanted to do. That sounded like you were still pursuing something. What was your mindset after the UFC?
Um, you know, I still like the idea of competing. I really did like fighting and stuff like that. I knew like the self-preservation, but I also thought that this was a way of getting into new shows. And if I can get out there, then my students and my other fighters behind me could get. If I show up there and do that, hey, we got other guys and get them into different shows and stuff like that. So I idea was like, you kind of want to keep your dream alive type thing. But then again, you're like, you know what? I mean, this if this opens up doors for other fighters and stuff like that, that as a business decision, I think that I also looked at it that way. So it wasn't so much like, hey, I mean, I was in good shape and stuff like that, but it was like one of those situations that um the one fight I had a fight in Russia. Remember that one? I hurt my rib like the week or 2 weeks before. So I was fighting, was it Islam or something like that, his name? And that fight right there was the one that kind of really realized, wait a minute, you know, we can do what we want, but certain things, I mean, it wasn't even a close fight. That was one of those things, and it was a 10-minute fight. And then we had that one guy in the corner. Who's in the corner? He was a ref for Kimbo Slice's fight when he
Troy.
lost. Troy. Troy is my corner. And also like, oh Dave, they're calling for the overtime. I said, I thought after 10 minutes, whoever was win, it's ended. And they're like, no, they're gonna call it a draw. I'm like, why? It wasn't even close. So that's why when we fought again and he'd gone through he went through 2 head throws, and I just went with it just because my ribs were hurting so bad and I couldn't fight it. And that was like, well, they gave us a draw afterwards. And I'm like, what is the point of fighting for a draw when it wasn't a draw the first time? And it's like, you know what I mean? That it was something like that. I was like, that's just like, well, you're not going to win a decision in these countries or these other shows. So then, like, Ansar and those other fights, it's going to be hard to like grind out victories. So it was almost like, I'm going to go for a first round. If I get caught, I get caught. If I win, I win. So it
I
was
don't know,
one of those situations.
but the Ansar fight, because Ansar caught you quickly. And I think that's a sign of respect too. I think he was a little worried and he got a chance and he took it. But I don't you he was heavy and he was not
Yeah,
playing. Wait, there was they played the shuck and jive. I think back about that. And usually, and I think after that too, you became a lot tougher on making sure your opponent made weight and stuff. But they were very elusive on Chalangov's weight.
yeah. And I said that he wasn't because I remember weighing in and I was under like 5 pounds. I said, no, it's not. And then all of a sudden they said, no, he's right on. I said, let me see. And they didn't. And I'm like, no. And I remember telling you, I said, he was not on weight. That scale is way off. If he's on weight, he's over 10
Yeah.
pounds, 7 or 5 kilos or whatever it was. And I said, there's no way I'm underweight and stuff like that. So yeah, he was bigger. And I even said that. And then he was overweight against Nick Thompson when they fought.
Yeah.
Um, and Nick Thompson was a bigger guy. So I mean, they took the fight, but he was a big guy and he was strong. And it was like at that stage, I mean, it's like, I mean, I haven't, my business is doing well. My
Yeah.
career has been good. So it's one of those things that I took fights that,
Yeah. No,
had like,
rush it. You're not making a ton of money, and they're going to dick you at the weigh-ins. Hey, you know, they
yeah,
got what their money's worth. I understand, but
yeah.
and here's anybody who your guys Pat O'Malley and Ron Faircloth started around this time the Madtown Throwdown, and you were the main event of the first one against Pat Healy. You
Yeah.
know, Pat Healy from the Fighting Healy brothers out there from Oregon. This is another, half century club guy, tons of fights. What was that fight like?
He is tough. I mean, I was like, yeah, I'll do this for you because we need a big name. I'm like, fine, I'll do it. And I actually didn't fight for money for him. I fought for the ring. They let me keep the ring that they used or something like that. So they bought a ring for me, which is in the Waukegan gym. But it was one of those situations. I'm like, fine, I'll do it. And that's when I don't know how long ago it was, but my rib got hurt again. And I remember I'm like, shoot. So, he was on top of me or he got my back and, I fought through that. And I'm like, gosh, my rib is killing me and stuff like that. So I just took him down and just pounded on his body, right? And then after the second round, Brian Garrity runs in and picks me up and carries me. I'm like, there's one round to go. And he goes,
Mhm.
oh, I thought that was it. I said, no, there's one. So I went and I actually caught him in an omoplata. And I remember somebody came, oh my gosh, I've never seen an omoplata in an MMA match. But so people can like, from my bottom, I had good jujitsu skills. People don't understand that. Um, but he was a tough guy. I mean, um,
Now the next fight after that too, and yeah, Pat Healy's a guy who doesn't get enough respect in my book, but and then the guy after that is all time great George St. Pierre, and again I think it's the same thing what you're talking about at this point. They called you up, you got a name. It's a main event spot. You're picking and choosing your fights. But what was George like? Because you're getting an early, young George St. Pierre, and you're the old lion at this point.
um, well, the crazy thing about that, I was in decent shape. It was a short nose fight, maybe 10 days. And I went out to Rockton, Illinois, um, with Justin Weeman and Brad Lynn to train with them for the weekend before that fight. Because they had really good wrestlers. I really wanted to work a wrestling thing and stuff like that. So I went out there. I met Pat and Ron, and I think Garrity came out with us. So it was a real good training camp. We were great shape and stuff like that. But I remember I put on wrestling shoes, and when I tied my shoes, it felt like there was a rock right by the laces. And I'm like, God, that's a weird feeling. So train and stuff like that. What I found out that I had MRSA in my ankle. And
Oh,
so I had MRSA that Saturday. Sunday I had to go to the hospital, spend the night because I had MRSA in my that ankle joint. And I was on crutches that Monday. And I was walking out of the hospital, and my ex-fiance goes, hey, you can't fight because the fight was Friday or Saturday. And I said, you're right, because I was on crutches. And so I called up Pat. I said, hey, I can't fight. I'm on crutches. And Pat goes, and I remember his word, he goes, Dave, they bought the ticket already. You have to go. And then I was like, you're right. I have to. So I said, fine, I'll do it. And then, so I couldn't run. I couldn't do anything to cut weight. So I had little harder time to cut weight. Well, what happened was we get to the airport and they lose my luggage. Luggage never comes through or anything like that. And then when we're going through customs, um, Ron and I were together and they asked me, they said, hey, wherever you guys ever arrested. And when I was in college, I'd been arrested, right? Not charged with anything but twice, right? It's just silly college things. And Ron told me before, don't say you were. I said, no, I wasn't. And Ron's there, he goes, nope, I haven't. And he goes, are you guys sure? Because we can check. And no. Are you sure? Because finally said, yeah, once when I was in college. So they made us go into like a waiting room. And Ron's like, why the hell would you say that? I said, I don't know. They kept repeating it. I thought maybe they knew. And so I was kind of worried. And then whatchamacallit, as I was like, sitting there and stuff like that, the guy comes back probably like an hour later. And, the promoter was, I think, calling maybe you or something like that. Are you sure they got on a plane? We can't find it. And so they came back and said, no, you came up clean, but Ron had something. And I'm like, shoot, I'm gonna lose my corner man or something like that. But they let us in because Ron talked his way in or something like that. I said, but hey, I don't have my bag. I can't find my bag. And I go, oh, here's the number. So you have to call number. So we went to the hotel and stuff like that. And every time we'd call the number, it was in French. They were in Montreal. And I couldn't hear it. So I had like the people at the front of the hotel keep calling. And they couldn't find it. Like, Ron, what are we gonna do? So I only had the clothes on my back. So I'm trying to cut weight and wearing maybe bronze clothes or something like that. And then I had to wear, I think I wore Jeff Curran shorts, and I had to go buy a mouth guard and a cup. And like, we couldn't find anywhere to boil water. So I was running around the stadium in Montreal, right, half hour, 2 hours before the fight. And they had to boil my mouth guard in weenie water, where they boil hot dogs, in order for me to fit it. So that's how I had Jeff Curran shorts on. I had weenie water mouthpiece on. And, I didn't know if I even had a sweatshirt or anything to warm up, but I went out there and fought like that. I mean, like I said, it was one of those situations. And after the fight, the crazy thing was, I'm just like pissed, just kind of a mess. We go to check in the fly back, right? And I'm going there and we go up to the lady right there at the front desk and like we're checking in and stuff like that. And I said, hey, did anybody find my bag? Just kind of like that. She goes, oh yeah, here it is. And she just goes right behind the counter and she pulls it out and gives me my bag. It was like sitting behind the counter for 3-4 days, whatever it was.
Oh,
and I'm
God.
like, nobody else could give me that. No, you know what I mean? So that was the whole trip to Canada, Montreal.
So, and what was St. Pierre? What was St. Pierre like? Because he usually gets, when he became a big star, he was a gentleman and he always conducted himself pretty good. But some of those early Canadian shows on the smaller side could be pretty rugged.
He was nice and stuff like that. He was polite. I do remember him being like explosive but he didn't feel as strong as I thought he would. He wasn't like really strong. I thought Nick Aguilar and Hank Aguilar were stronger, with the grip strength, and so he didn't feel like super strong. I mean, he was fast and explosive, but I didn't find him as strong. He he was quick though, so
Cool. All right, brother. We're coming up on 2 hours. We've been talking. I could keep it going for a bunch too, but I'm going to give you and your family a break, and thank you very much for this time. I just want to point out to the people out there, Dave's a school teacher now, and he probably hasn't really watched or done a bunch of UFC stuff in a long time. We're taping this at the same time that John Jones is returning to the octagon for, the first time in 3 years. And I would have rather, I'm glad I spent the time with Dave, and I don't really care what happened there. I'll catch up to it afterwards. When was the last time you saw UFC, buddy?
You know what? If I don't have anybody invested or something like that, I don't really watch that much. Gerald Mearshant, remember him? He came through our gym. So I like to pick up clips of him. He's one of those guys from
Sure.
Racine area. So if people are involved, I'll see the clips of those people and stuff like that. But it's not something that I look into that much.
I understand. Good. And why don't you go ahead and give the address for your gym up in the Milwaukee area? Because Racine and wherever you are now, because I think you got 2 spots too. Doesn't Garrity run a spot for you? Give us.
Kenosha, Wisconsin. It's on 3309 60th Street in Kenosha. And in Waukegan, Illinois, I have one at 125 Corey Avenue in Waukegan, Illinois.
And that's where Garrity's the leader.
Actually, Garrity doesn't do it. He works for UPS now.
Okay.
Jose Vega runs it. And Jose Vega is one of those littler guys that can punch so hard. I mean, he's the one that when with us not doing that many shows and stuff like that, it's I think he missed his window, which is a shame because he would have been super good at 125.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. It sometimes is a bittersweet sport, my friend. Thank you very much for catching up with us here at the MMA Museum.
All right, thank you.